All right, next, the guy I'm proud to call a friend and somebody that right now is reaching out. We're reaching out to the urban community, such an important sector to go after when it comes to our gun rights. And Rick Ector is making a name for himself in Detroit like nobody's business. And I want to welcome him for the first time speaking at the Gun Rights Policy Conference. And believe me, Detroit CCW, Rick Ector, Detroit's his blog up there, Rick's Firearm Academy of Detroit. He's got a lot going on. There's not enough room on here. I'll let him tell you. But please give a really big warm welcome for Rick Ector for his first time at a Gun Rights Policy Conference.
Great, thank you very much. It's truly an honor to be invited to speak before you all here at the Gun Rights Policy Conference, because it's actually at this conference where I really started seeing and envisioning myself as a gun rights advocate. Back home in Detroit, before I even really acquired this voracious appetite for firearms and gun rights and having this portfolio of firearms, you know, I was just a regular guy. I was off on the side of the gun rights arguments. Guns was a topic that I was fairly ambivalent about. It wasn't until I had an epiphany, and this epiphany occurred during a robbery of myself in my backyard after I parked my car in the garage. And it was at that point that I said, you know what, maybe I should take on a more active role in my personal protection. And in the aftermath of that incident, I survived, luckily. The biggest bruise that I achieved was one to my ego, okay? So quickly brushed that off and stepped up to the plate. I went to local law enforcement and I said, hey, I got robbed, you know, and they kind of looked at me like, okay, who's next, right? And I had to really talk with those guys to find out who was actually going to actually take the report. And a couple of officers were there and they were kind of shrugging their shoulders. And I'm like, wow, you know, now I'm being victimized a second time. Got robbed in my own backyard. And now I go to the police station. I'm trying to do the right thing and actually report this incident because I'm thinking, you know, what I've seen on those TV news shows, you know what, they're going to do their research, their due diligence, and they're going to find the bad guys who actually did this to me and bring them to justice. I was a little disillusioned, to say the very least. So I went through a point where I said, well, it's either put up or shut up time. Either I'm going to further barricade myself in my home in Detroit, or I'm going to go out and take on a more active role in my personal protection. I went out and did all the requirements in the state of Michigan, got myself a concealed pistol license, and I basically consumed all the literature and information and websites that I could on firearm safety, on personal protection, strategies, tactics, you name it. I knew pretty much everything that was out there. And as part of this learning curve, you know, I wasn't learning as much for every hour that I invested in study. So I joined the National Rifle Association. I was admitted to their firearms instructor training program, became a firearms instructor, and I started picking up certifications and started training. And in Detroit, which I imagine is not too much different from most urban areas, you know, the fire that had lit inside of me, a passion for gun rights and for having the ability to defend myself against some bad guy who had the audacity to size me up as a victim. You know, there was a disconnect between how hard I was fighting to get people trained so that they can defend themselves and not rely on law enforcement agencies to get there whenever they could. You know, the bar back home at that time was, okay, well, you're doing pretty good if you call 911 and they get to your place in 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes. And the way that they calculate response times is even crazier. It's not from the time that you pick up the phone and say, help, send police. It's from the time that they call and it goes to the dispatcher, and when the dispatcher can find an available unit, it's from the time that that dispatcher tells a particular unit to go to your house That's when they start calculating the response time. So they'll tell the media, hey, we got there in 5 minutes. Well, gee, if the car was only 5 minutes away and they just found out about it 5 minutes ago, well, what about that other 25 minutes when I first placed the call? So as I got more and more into gun rights, I started becoming more politically aware of all the challenges because, hey, I truly enjoy being able to carry a pistol to defend myself if I need to. And so as you become more politically aware, you're more cognizant of the topics and conversations that comes up, of the politics and the people who are running for offices and the promises that they make. And in some urban areas, such as Detroit, we had leadership at the time who were of the mindset that more citizens taking on a more active role in their personal protection was not in the city's best interest, because in their eyes, I'm just another person who has a gun in the city of Detroit, and by extension, through this twisted logic that they have, me, a law-abiding citizen who can pass a background check, well, that somehow is going to make Detroit less safe. So, undaunted, I started doing some research out on the internet, and I thought, well, gee, with all this work that I'm putting in and I'm trying to get out and network and meet people, maybe, just maybe, I'm trying to reinvent the wheel. So how can I find other people like me? So I fired up my browser and I typed this phrase in quotes into my browser. I typed, black man with a gun. And lo and behold, there's Ken Blanchard's flagship website. And I'm like, I found it, Eureka. And I read everything on Ken's website, man, and I learned so much, where he talks about the history of gun control and various people in the gun rights movement, people who have published and written before. I learned about the Deacons for Defense. I learned about Robert F. Williams. I mean, I digested it, everything. And he still has a podcast, and I actually was logging into the podcast every week. And it was during that initial podcast where he was talking about the 2007 Gun Rights Policy Conference. And it was to be held in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, right across the bridge from Cincinnati. And so the way Ken was talking up this conference, I was thinking that maybe I would go. And the way that he described this conference, he said, look, there's probably going to be a few hundred people there. There's probably going to be the most welcoming crowd you will ever see. There's people from every gun group that's going to be present. There's no pretentiousness. You will be well received. His message was, just come. So I started talking to some of my close friends. I said, hey, look, I'm thinking about going to a gun rights conference in Kentucky. And they were like, good luck with that, right? So I almost got talked out of not going, and my mindset was, well, hey, we have reciprocity with Kentucky. I'll bring my gun with me, and we'll see what happens. And I will say I was warmly received. And it is from that meeting, the Gun Rights Policy Convention in 2007, that I really got a chance to network and meet a lot of people. Of course, Ken was there. And I must have shadowed Ken for a couple of hours, and I know he must have looked around and was like, hey, this guy is still here, right? But I met other people. I even had a conversation with John Lott, who was there, who's actually at the conference this year. And I met John Pierce, who runs opencarry.org, and an event I had several years later, he actually came out and was one of the speakers at one of my events. So coming to a conference like this is really great and is really energizing, because for my personal story, it started with Ken. And that's the first method that I'm going to talk about with respect to urban outreach, and that's to be a beacon, to be someone out there, to be that lighthouse in the ocean of conversation about guns and gun rights. And because Ken was there, I was able to find Ken, and through Ken, I was able to raise my level of knowledge about the politics of guns and become more politically active in Detroit. And I'm actually completed that cycle with this conference this year here in 2016. Young man that I was able to reach out and meet based on a case that he picked up with regards to defending himself and another woman, and he ended up getting charged with 8 felonies. Ultimately, justice prevailed. He's here today. Marcus Weldon, please stand up. So it's with that, completing the cycle, being a resource, being a beacon. You never know when you put information out there who you're going to reach and who you're going to affect and what type of changes that you can make. With regards to being a beacon, it could be person to person, or it could be some website entity, it could be some channel on YouTube, but just be that resource, particularly when we're talking about urban outreach. There's not a very welcome environment in many cities across our country. To be quite frank, many of our large cities across America have some of the most draconian gun laws that are on the books. And they also have some of the most anti-gun politicians, and they have some of the highest incident rates of violent crime all over the country. These are people who need gun rights the most. Typically, people who are politicians in these urban areas, they will typically look to organizations like the NRA and the GRPC and say, well, hey, where's all the representation? You know what? And they'll even be so bold as to say gun rights aren't for black people or brown people or anyone who's actually in the movement. And aside from being not only a beacon, I think it's really important that if we agree that gun rights in urban America is important, and if we want to have outreach, I believe it's also important that we do specific events. Doesn't have to be the type of events that I do and that I perform, but do something in your local community that will draw these people to you. Unfortunately, there was this one grisly incident I caught on my local news one night, and it concerned itself with a woman who was relatively young in age, who had not really started living her life. Unfortunately, her body was found discarded in the street as if it was a piece of trash. And it affected me on a very sincere level. I thought, hey, someone should do something about that. Someone should do something. Someone should reach out and empower women such that atrocities on this level could not happen again. So I had a eureka moment. I went over to my social media page of choice, which is Facebook, and I typed as my status, free shooting lesson for women. No guns, no ammo, no range time, no fees. I'll have whatever you need. Just come to the gun range. Believe it or not, there were 50 women that year who boldly answered my challenge to trust me, a guy out on Facebook talking about the importance of self-defense and being able to protect yourself so that you won't potentially be a victim like this woman who was left discarded in the street. I am happy to report a few years later, as a matter of fact, this past July 31st of this year, the 5th iteration, annual iteration of this community event for women, all women who are at least curious about learning how to safely operate a firearm and take on a more active role in their personal protection. I had 417 women get trained in gun safety in just one day. Of course, I couldn't do that by myself. I needed a lot of people, and I attracted these people by being out there, being that beacon. I had 35 fellow firearms instructors, at least 10 fellow range safety officers. I was able to explain to a gun range owner that it was in his best interest to open up his range to 400 women in one day. And you know what? A lot of those women showed up, and a lot of them bought guns, and they bought holsters, they bought range equipment, eyes, ears, ammunition, and I'm proud to report that next year, the first Sunday after Mother's Day, we're going to do it again. And I'm telling you, if we are serious about urban outreach, we need to be beacons, and we need to put on events in those communities to draw those people to us so they can join us in the fight for gun rights. Thank you very much.